At long last, we are about to get stuck into the final installment of our wisdom series called The Beginning of Wisdom. And to finish it off, we're going to read through the Sermon on the Mount. You've been waiting for this since like August, as it is recorded by the Apostle Matthew. Now, I know it's been a long time between drinks, so if you're keen, you might enjoy going back and listening to the sermons that have been a part of this series. There's 12 of them so far. It's got its own special little playlist on our YouTube podcast, and you're welcome to do a refresh in your own time. The concept in a nutshell so far is this: if we want to know what life is all about, why we are here, and how to succeed in whatever it is mankind is meant to do, or more specifically for our context, what we as Tin Can Bay Community Church are meant to do, we are going to need wisdom. Wisdom. And the scriptures make it abundantly clear that it is the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. And we've been camping out in this whole idea for nearly a year. Throughout our overview of the writings, generally known as the wisdom books of the Hebrew Scripture, we've found this clear theme running throughout, that mankind is meant to find its purpose by having a close relationship with, reflecting and listening to and obeying our Creator God. And this is elegantly described both in the teaching sections of the Hebrew Scriptures, but also within the narrative sections of the Hebrew Scriptures, both of which are neatly woven together throughout what we call our Old Testament. Yeah? And together they are telling the same story, and nowhere is this more clear than in what's known as the Torah, the scrolls of instruction, which are the first 5 books in our Old Testament. And right in the middle, in this, the account of Israel's journey into Egypt, its exodus out of Egypt, its wandering in the wilderness, and its receiving of the law of God from Moses on the holy mountain. Why is this important? Well, this morning, let me show you something that once I was shown it, became impossible to unsee. And it affects the entire way that I read the Gospel of Matthew. Look what happens when we place the first 7 chapters of Matthew's account of the Gospel of Jesus alongside the Exodus account found in the Old Testament. Both Matthew chapter 1 and 2 and Exodus chapter 1 and 2 begin in a similar way. Exodus 1:1-7 sets the stage for the development of the nation of Israel through Jacob's sons, multiplying in Egypt. Matthew opens his account of the gospel of Jesus by tracing his lineage back to Abraham, couching Jesus' heritage within the story of Israel, marking him as the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham and David. If you remember, we looked at this in more detail the week before Christmas. And these chapters share another strong similarity. In Exodus, Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, orders all Hebrew male babies to be killed. That's in Exodus 1:22. In Matthew, it's the King Herod who orders another massacre of little boys in Bethlehem, with the intention of killing Jesus and stopping God's chosen king who would bring about God's redemptive plan. This is all described in Matthew 2:16-18. Now lay these 2 chapters side by side, and we have both Moses and Jesus, who were born into a time of great oppression and are miraculously saved to become Israel's deliverer. So it appears that already the reader of Matthew is intended to start reading the New Testament about Jesus in light of both the story of Israel as a nation, but more specifically in light of Moses as God's chosen person to lead and deliver Israel. Talk about a good intro to the New Testament, yeah? As a Jew, it would make you want to read more. But that's just the intro. We haven't even got started yet. In Matthew chapter 2, 13 to 23, Jesus is taken by Joseph, his earthly father, down to Egypt to escape King Herod and this massacre of the children. And this mirrors how Jacob and his family escaped terrible famine by also migrating to Egypt. And this was brought about by Jacob's son, who also just happened to be named Joseph. Hyperlink, anyone? That's in Genesis 46, 1 to 7. And to make the parallels clearer, Matthew explicitly references the prophet Hosea from chapter 11, verse 1. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, in context, Hosea is talking about Moses and Israel leaving Egypt, meaning Matthew is explicitly marking Jesus as the true Son of God, a new type of Moses who embodies Israel's own story and will deliver them in an even greater way than had occurred in the Exodus. And so, if that's the theory, let's test it, okay? Let's see what happens as we dig and read a little further through the book of Matthew. As Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, you know the story, they pass through the waters of the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, where God supernaturally and visibly demonstrates his power to Israel, literally saving them from Pharaoh's army, but also marking the moment of their deliverance from slavery, the end of their old way of life, and the beginning of new lives, as having new identities as God's special covenant chosen people, a nation finally. And a major affirmation of Moses being God's authorized leader of Israel is here in Exodus 14:31. When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of God displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. This was the beginning of a brand new chapter in the story of Israel, and an important marker in God's ultimate plan to redeem mankind and to restore and perfect creation itself. In Matthew 3, 13 to 17, we have the story of Jesus as he's baptized in the waters of the River Jordan, marking the beginning of his public ministry and his self-identification with the plight of Israel. And as we'll see, the trajectory of the gospel accounts declare that he affirmed and joined with the plight of all mankind, not just Israel. See, we all need to be rescued. Humanity needs to be delivered from slavery to our great enemy and cleansed from all unrighteousness. And it's right here at Jesus' baptism that God again shows up with a visible, supernatural action, affirming Jesus' mission to the people watching on. Read this from Matthew 3. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Straight after the Israelites cross the Reed Sea, Israel wanders into the wilderness. And while it could have been a short journey, the wilderness wandering ends up lasting for 40 long years. 40 years where they're given opportunity after opportunity to face tests of faith and obedience, and yet continually fail. This is all described in Exodus 15 to 17 and Numbers 14:33 specifically. Now, directly after Jesus' baptism, when we link back to Matthew, what does Matthew record Jesus doing? Going out into the wilderness. Heading straight out there to spend 40 days in the wilderness to be tested by the accuser. This is in Matthew chapter 4. And here we see Israel constantly failing in their wilderness testing, and yet Jesus remains faithful. And this is the kicker. He even overcomes the temptations of the accuser by quoting from Old Testament passages of Scripture that are directly speaking about Israel's 40 years in the wilderness. The links are just off the scale. Jesus was tempted to depend on physical sustenance rather than God, but responds to the devil's temptation to command stones to become bread by quoting from Deuteronomy 8:3. "It is written," Jesus says, "man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." These words were first spoken by Moses, reminding Israel how God had humbled them in the wilderness by allowing them to hunger and by providing manna, teaching them to depend upon him. Then the accuser tempts Jesus to test God by demanding proof that God would care for him. And Jesus again quotes directly from the words of Moses in Deuteronomy 6:16, as he reminds Israel about the way that they tested God at a place called Massah. The word Massah literally means test, and what happened there is described in Exodus 17. Third, the accuser offers to give Jesus all authority, rule, and dominion over the earth if Jesus would only fall down and worship him, the Satan. And Jesus again quotes Moses. Matthew 4:10, he says, "Be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Straight out of Deuteronomy 6:13 and also in 10:20. Let's read that phrase from Deuteronomy 6:13. Moses says, "It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear." Does that remind you of something? Proverbs 9:10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Do you want to know how to live? Do you want to know how to survive? Do you want to know how to walk in the plans that I have for you? It all starts here, in the fear of the Lord and not of other things. Jesus puts the evil one in his place by affirming that God and God alone is to be worshipped, just as Moses was warning Israel to remain faithful to God and fearing him and him only, which is, as the Proverbs begins, the beginning of wisdom. Right where we began this sermon series exactly 1 year ago to the week. And you can't make this stuff up. So Jesus is revealed here to have the wisdom that Israel lacked, the wisdom to know how to live as true image bearers of God, the first human to pass the test faithfully and completely without falling. And then we arrive at the section of Matthew where we're going to camp out for the next couple of months, which is framed by the Apostle Matthew to be a mirror of the moment that Moses ascends Mount Sinai in the Exodus 19 to 20, receiving the law of God and delivering it to Israel. So here in Matthew, Jesus ascends a mountain to deliver his sermon. Don't miss how important this symbolism is for understanding what Jesus is doing in this message. What Matthew is doing as he records it in the way that he has. At Mount Sinai, God provided the 10 Commandments along with all the rest of what we call the Mosaic Law, an outline of how Israel was called to live as God's holy people. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching now with divine authority as God incarnate, as God himself, the divinely appointed human leader of all of God's people. And here he proceeds to lay the foundation for how his kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, is going to shape those who follow him in such a profound way that they will become a new covenant community of God's people, like had never been seen before. People whose very existence, as we will see in the coming weeks, will be characterized by righteousness and mercy and the love of God and the love of others. Importantly, Jesus doesn't abandon or obliterate the law of Moses. Rather, in just the same way that he expanded and fulfilled and more faithfully walked the narrative story of Moses and Israel, so too Jesus is about to expand and fulfill the law, or a good translation might be to fill it full, by teaching the spirit and the ideal behind the laws that were given to Moses. A law that is less about the dot points and entirely about the heart and the motivations of a person's inner being that work themselves out in a way that is visible in a person's life. And that's what we'll be investigating in the coming weeks. Now, to lay all of my cards on the table so you know where I'm going, at the beginning of this final part of the series, here is my belief. The first 7 chapters of Matthew's description of the gospel is the account of Jesus who faithfully relives Israel's story, but succeeds where Israel failed. He is the faithful Son of God who perfectly obeys the Father. And the first 7 chapters of Matthew's description of the gospel is also the account of Jesus who has become this greater Moses, who not only delivers God's people from spiritual slavery and sin and death, but also inaugurates a new covenant which fulfills the core, the very heart, the spirit of what the law of Moses was intended to point towards. Put together, this means that the first 7 chapters of Matthew's description of the gospel, in the apostles' reflection, is how Jesus ultimately fulfilled all the prophecies and all the typologies of the Hebrew scriptures, and how Jesus is the ultimate culmination of God's redemptive plan for all mankind. Now, if that is what Matthew intended, which I believe it is, then it infers that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is his own commentary on what it looks like to truly live as God intended, to fulfill the law and to live as citizens of the kingdom of heaven that he was ushering in. Meaning, if we want to know what life is all about, why we are here, and how to succeed in whatever it is mankind is meant to do on God's kingdom here on earth, we better pay attention to what Jesus says as he steps up onto the mountain and starts to speak. Because he is going to describe the kind of life that the law was pointing towards, the kind of life that the prophets were pointing towards. The kind of life that Jesus not only displayed for us, but expects of us as those who desire to follow him. So as we begin this series, there are 2 things that I recommend that I believe will help us as a family to chew on the teaching that is to come, because some of it's intense. The first is not a must, but it's a recommendation, if you can take that as that. I ask you to consider getting locked into a small group, a home group of some description from our church body, yeah? If you aren't in one, join one. If there's not enough space or you don't like those groups, start one, okay? Get around some other brothers and sisters because it's so helpful. In our home group, we've committed to discussing these sermons and their applications during our studies on a Sunday evening. And I didn't come up with that idea, that was their great. And I believe that, particularly during this next series on the Sermon on the Mount, that our church small groups are going to find that kind of study really, really, really super helpful. Because it's good to thrash out what's being said. It's good to thrash out what hasn't been said, yeah? To bring about those questions that we still have, because questions and tensions are a natural and productive aspect of wisdom literature. They're going to come up. So it's good to have brothers and sisters to chew on with, yeah? My second recommendation is, together as a family, to get serious about how Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5-7 applies to our lives individually and corporately, both now and into the future. And it is by, as a whole church body for the next 10 weeks or so up until Easter, to begin praying the Lord's Prayer together every time we meet. I come from, I'm a Baptist pastor. I grew up in Baptist churches. We don't do tradition, okay? We threw all that out. But I believe that we've lost something because of that. And I wonder if for this season it might be greatly beneficial for us as a church family to pray together in this way that Jesus taught. The reason is because, as we'll see in the coming weeks, and without giving away too much, the prayer that we call the Lord's Prayer is situated in the very center of Jesus' sermon as recorded in Matthew, highlighting it specifically as a key aspect of the entire message. And I believe that that prayer itself will help us to internalize what we are hearing and to keep it at the front of our minds each and every day and not just on Sundays. And so this morning as I close, I want to encourage us to do that. Would you be willing to stand with me as we say the Lord's Prayer together? Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.